And welcome back to Tangents on Cracked Spines with your host, myself, Frankie. It has been brought to my attention that I should be doing recaps. So normally it'll just be from the episode before. This one is a quick synopsis of the book so far. We are listening to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and it starts off where we're talking to a rich man who turned sailor, turned captain, who is desperate to make his mark in history by finding the North Pole. The further north he goes, and we find this out because he's writing letters to his sister, he finds a massive man on a sledge going through the ice while they're stuck in it, in his ship. And a little while later, there is a man who we find out to be Victor Frankenstein, who had been following that man that they had seen earlier. All of his dogs on his sled had passed away, and he was in dire straits. And while he's recovering, he befriends the captain, and we begin his story. He grew up in an idyllic little house in Geneva. He was learning, not from school, but from books of his own, where he was praising alchemists. When his mother dies, he winds up going to school in Germany, I believe. And there he finds a passion for chemistry and the natural sciences in general, but specifically then into anatomy, where he discovers that he can animate dead tissue or inanimate objects. And that is when he creates his monster. And when his monster awakens, Victor is terrified and runs to his room and paces until he passes out. He wakes up to his monster being like, "Daddy!" In his room. He's terrified that the monster's going to kill him, so he locks himself out of his house for the night. Winds up meeting a long-lost friend because he hasn't been a good friend in contact with his family in Geneva for the past 2 years. He's been at college. Catches up a little bit and then goes into a delirium and fever for 2 months. And when he comes back out, his friend is like, "Hey, you were saying some weird stuff while you were sick. We really should talk about that, and you should also, tell your family that you're okay." He writes a letter to his family and is like, "I'm gonna conveniently forget you said anything about what I said during my delirium." And that's where we'll pick up. His friend's name is Clerval. Chapter 5. Clerval then put the following letter into my hands. To V. Frankenstein. My dear cousin, I cannot describe to you the uneasiness we have all felt concerning your health. We cannot help imagining that your friend Clerval conceals the extent of your disorder, for it is now several months since we have seen your handwriting, and all this time you have been obliged to dictate your letters to Henry. Surely, Victor, you must have been exceedingly ill, and this makes us all very wretched, so nearly as after the death of your dear mother. My uncle was almost persuaded that you were indeed dangerously ill, and could hardly be restrained from undertaking a journey to Ingolstadt. Clerval always writes that you are getting better. I eagerly hope that you will confirm this intelligence soon in your own handwriting. For indeed, Victor, we are all very miserable on this account. Relieve us from this fear, and we shall be the happiest creatures in the world. Your father's health is now so vigorous that he appears 10 years younger since last winter. Ernest also is so much improved that you would hardly know him. I'm assuming Ernest is one of the younger brothers. I'm not sure they've been named up till now. He is now nearly 16 and has lost that sickly appearance which he had some years ago. He has grown quite robust and active. My uncle and I conversed a long time last night about what profession Ernest should follow. His constant illness when young has deprived him of the habits of application, and now that he enjoys good health, he is continually in the open air, climbing the hills, or rowing on the lake. I therefore propose that he should be a farmer, which you know, cousin, is a favorite scheme of mine. A farmer's is a very healthy, happy life. Really? They're a hard life. And, your livelihood is literally at the whim of Mother Earth. So, no, and you don't get to retire or have days off. I'm not sure where she's thinking a farmer's life is happy and carefree. And the least hurtful, or rather the most beneficial profession of any. Honey, you are delusional about farmers. My uncle had an idea of his being educated as an advocate, that through his interest he might become a judge. But besides that, he is not at all fitted for such an occupation. It is certainly more creditable to cultivate the earth for the sustenance of man than to be the confidant and sometimes the accomplice of his vices, which is the profession of a lawyer. I said that the employments of a prosperous farmer, if they were not a more honorable, they were at least a happier species of occupation than that of a judge, whose misfortune it was always to meddle with the dark side of human nature. I can agree with that as a testament to judges. My uncle smiled and said that I ought to be an advocate myself, which put an end to the conversation on that subject. And now I must tell you a story that will please and perhaps amuse you. Do you not remember Justine Moritz? Probably you do not. I will relate her history, therefore, in a few words. Madame Moritz, her mother, was a widow with 4 children, of whom Justine was the third. This girl had always been the favorite of her father, but through a strange perversity her mother could not endure her, and after the death of M. Moritz, treated her very ill. My aunt observed this, and when Justine was 12 years of age, prevailed on her mother to allow her to live at her house. The republican institutions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in the great monarchies that surround it. Hence there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and the lower orders being neither so poor nor so despised. Their manners are more refined and moral. A servant in Geneva does not mean the same thing as a servant in France or England. Justine, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. Too bad America can't learn that. After what I have said, I dare say you well remember the heroine of my little tale, for Justine was a great favorite of yours, and I recollect you once remarked that if you were in an ill humor, one glance from Justine could dissipate it, for the same reason that Ariosto gives concerning the beauty of Angelica. She looked so frank-hearted and happy. My aunt conceived a great attachment for her, by which she was induced to give her an education superior to that which she had first intended. This benefit was fully repaid. Justine was the most grateful little creature in the world. I do not mean that she made any professions. I never heard one pass her lips, but you could see by her eyes that she almost adored her protectress. Although her disposition was gay and in many respects inconsiderate, yet she paid the greatest attention to every gesture of my aunt. She thought her the model of all excellence, and endeavored to imitate her phraseology and manners, so that even now she often reminds me of her. When my dearest aunt died, everyone was too much occupied in their own grief to notice poor Justine, who had tended her during her illness with the most anxious affection. Poor Justine was very ill, but other trials were reserved for her. One by one, her brothers and sister died, and her mother, with the exception of her neglected daughter, was left childless. The conscience of the woman was troubled. She began to think that the deaths of her favorites was a judgment from heaven to chastise her partiality. She was a Roman Catholic, and I believe her confessor confirmed the idea which she had conceived. Accordingly, a few months after your departure for Ingolstadt, Justine was called home by her repentant mother. Poor girl, she wept when she quitted our house. She was much altered since the death of my aunt. Grief had given softness and a winning mildness to her manners, which had before been remarkable and vivacious. Nor was her residence at her mother's house of a nature to restore her gaiety. The poor woman was very vacillating in her repentance. She sometimes begged Justine to forgive her unkindness, but much oftener accused her of having caused the deaths of her brothers and sister. Perpetual fretting at length threw Madame Moritz into a decline, which at first increased her irritability, but she is now at peace forever. She died on the first approach of cold weather, at the beginning of this last winter. Justine has returned to us, and I assure you I love her tenderly. She is very clever and gentle and extremely pretty. As I mentioned before, her mien and her expressions continually remind me of my dear aunt. I must say also a few words to you, my dear cousin, of little darling William. I wish you could see him. He is very tall of his age, with sweet, laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair. When he smiles, 2 little dimples appear on each cheek, which are rosy with health. He has already had 1 or 2 little wives, but Louisa Byron is his favorite, a pretty little girl of 5 years of age. Oh, look, it's been a couple centuries since this was written, and people still have not evolved from having toddlers being engaged or favoriting each other in a romantic way that they cannot quite fathom yet. Now, dear Victor, I dare say you wish to be indulged in a little gossip concerning the good people of Geneva. The pretty Miss Mansfield has already received the congratulatory visits on her approaching marriage with a young Englishman, John Melbourne, Esquire. Her ugly sister, Manon, married M. Dulville, the rich banker, last autumn. You may call her ugly, but she married rich, though we don't know whether Divillard is a nice man or not. Your favorite schoolfellow, Louis Manoir, has suffered several misfortunes since the departure of Clerval from Geneva, but he has already recovered his spirits and is reported to be on the point of marrying a very lively, pretty Frenchwoman, Madame Tavernier. She is a widow and much older than Manoir, but she is very much admired and a favorite with everybody. I have written myself into good spirits, dear cousin, yet I cannot conclude without again anxiously inquiring concerning your health. Dear Victor, if you are not very ill, write yourself, and make your father and all of us happy, or I cannot bear to think of the other side of the question. My tears already flow. Adieu, my dearest cousin. Elizabeth Lavenza, Geneva, March 18th, 17. Dear Elizabeth, I exclaimed when I had read her letter, I will write instantly and relieve them from the anxiety they must feel. I wrote, and this exertion greatly fatigued me, but my convalescence had commenced and proceeded regularly. In another fortnight I was able to leave my chamber. One of my first duties on my recovery was to introduce Clerval to the several professors of the university. In doing this, I underwent a rough kind of usage, ill-befitting the wounds that my mind had sustained. Ever since that fatal night, the end of my labors and the beginning of my misfortunes, I had convinced a violent antipathy even to the name of natural philosophy. When I was otherwise quite restored to health, the sight of a chemical instrument would renew all the agony of my nervous symptoms. Henry saw this and had removed all my apparatus from my view. He had also changed my apartment, for he perceived that I had acquired a dislike for the room which had previously been my laboratory. But these cares of Clerval were made of no avail when I visited the professors. Mr. Waldman inflicted torture when he praised, with kindness and warmth, the astonishing progress I had made in the sciences. He soon perceived that I disliked the subject, but, not guessing the real cause, he attributed my feelings to modesty, and changed the subject from my improvement to the science itself, with a desire, as I evidently saw, of drawing me out. What could I do? He meant to please, and he tormented me. I felt as if he had placed carefully, one by one, in my view, those instruments which were to me to be afterwards used in putting me to a slow and cruel death. I writhed under his words, yet dared not exhibit the pain I felt. Clerval, whose eyes and feelings were always quick in discerning the sensations of others, declined the subject, alleging in excuse his total ignorance, and the conversation took a more general turn. I thanked my friend from my heart, but I did not speak. I saw plainly that he was surprised, but he had never attempted to draw my secret from me. And although I loved him with a mixture of affection and reverence that knew no bounds, yet I could never persuade myself to confide in him that event which was so often present to my recollection, but which I feared the detail to another would only impress more deeply. Mr. Kremp was not equally docile, and in my condition at that time, of most insupportable sensitiveness. His harsh, blunt encomiums gave me even more pain than the benevolent approach of Mr. Waldman. "Damn the fellow!" cried he. "Why, Mr. Clerval, I assure you he had outstripped us all. I stare if you please, but it is nevertheless true. A youngster who, but a few years ago, believed Cornelius Agrippa as firmly as the gospel, has now set himself at the head of the university, and if he is not soon pulled down, we shall be out of countenance. Aye, aye," he continued, observing my face expressive of suffering. "Mr. Frankenstein is modest, an excellent quality in a young man. Young men should be diffident of themselves, you know, Mr. Clerval. I was myself when young, but that wears out in very short time." Mr. Kremp was now commenced an eulogy on himself, which happily turned the conversation from a subject that was so annoying to me. Clerval was no natural philosopher. His imagination was too vivid for the minutiae of science. Languages were his principal study, and he sought, by acquiring their elements, to open a field for self-instruction on his return to Geneva. Persian, Arabic, and Hebrew gained his attention, after he had made himself perfectly master of Greek and Latin. For my own part, idleness had ever been irksome to me, and now that I wished to fly from reflection and hated my former studies, I felt great relief in being the fellow pupil with my friend, and found not only instruction but consolation in the works of the Orientalists. Their melancholy is soothing, and their joy elevating to a degree I never experienced in studying the authors of any other country. When you read their writings, life appears to consist in a warm sun and garden of roses, in the smiles and frowns of their fair enemy, and the fire that consumes your own heart. How different from the manly and heroical poetry of Greece and Rome. So I wonder if he'd be interested in manga and anime now. Summer passed away in these occupations, and my return to Geneva was fixed for the latter end of autumn. But being delayed by several accidents, winter and snow arrived. The roads were deemed impassable, and my journey was retarded until the ensuing spring. I felt this delay very bitterly, for I longed to see my native town and my beloved friends. My return had only been delayed so long from an unwillingness to leave Clerval in a strange place before he had become acquainted with any of its inhabitants. The winter, however, was spent cheerfully, and although the spring was uncommonly late, when it came, its beauty compensated for its dilatoriness. The month of May had already commenced, and I expected the letter daily which was to fix the date of my departure, when Henry proposed a pedestrian tour in the environs of Ingolstadt, that I might bid a personal farewell to the country I had so long inhabited. I assented with pleasure to his proposition. I was fond of exercise. Wow, I can read. I was fond of exercise, and Clerval had always been my favorite companion in the rambles of this nature that I had taken among the scenes of my native country. We passed a fortnight in these perambulations. My health and spirits had long been restored, and they gained additional strength from the salubrious air I breathed, the natural incidents of our progress, and the conversation of my friend. Study had before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures, and rendered me unsocial, but Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature, and the cheerful faces of children. I'm glad he likes children. I'm not a fan. Excellent friend, how sincerely did you love me and endeavor to elevate my mind, until it was on a level with your own. A selfish pursuit had cramped and narrowed me until your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses. I became the same happy creature who, a few years ago, loving and beloved by all, had no sorrow or care. That's nice privilege. When happy, inanimate nature had the power of bestowing on me the most delightful sensations. A serene sky and verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. The present season was indeed divine. The flowers of spring bloomed in the hedges, while those of summer were already in bud. I was undisturbed by thoughts which, during the preceding year, had pressed upon me, notwithstanding my endeavors to throw them off, with an invincible burden. Can I just say that the way the characters in this talk about each other, is total fanfic fodder. You can have all sorts of queer relationships and poly relationships thought up by the way they speak, because words don't mean the same they did when this was written. But also, the way toxic masculinity has taken place is such deep-rooted. Yeah. Friendships sound a lot more intimate than they do now. Henry rejoiced in my gaiety and sincerely sympathized in my feelings. He exerted himself to amuse me, while he expressed the sensations that filled his soul. The resources of his mind on this occasion were truly astonishing. His conversation was full of imagination, and very often in imitation of the Persian and Arabic writers. He invented tales of wonderful fancy and passion. At other times he repeated my favorite poems, or drew me out into arguments, which he supported with great ingenuity. We returned to our college on a Sunday afternoon. The peasants were dancing, and every one we met appeared gay and happy. Didn't I just say that? In a different meaning? My own spirits were high, and I bounded along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. Chapter 6. On my return, I found the following letter from my father. To Victor Frankenstein. My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you. But that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expected a happy and gay welcome, to behold, on the contrary, tears and wretchedness? And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? Absence cannot have rendered you callous to our joys and griefs. And how shall I inflict pain on an absent child? I wish to prepare you for the woeful news, but I know it is impossible. Even now, your eye skims over the page to seek the words which are to convey to you the horrible things. William is dead, that sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle yet so gay. Victor, he is murdered. I will not attempt to console you, but will simply relate the circumstances of the transaction. Last Thursday, May 7th, I, my niece, and your 2 brothers went to walk in Plain Palace. The evening was warm and serene, and we prolonged our walk further than usual. It was already dusk before we thought of returning, and when we discovered that William and Ernest, who had gone on before, were not to be found, we accordingly rested on a seat until they should return. Presently Ernest came and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said that they had been playing together, that William had run away to hide himself, and that he had vainly sought for him, and afterwards waited for him a long time, but that he did not return. This account rather alarmed us, and we continued to search for him until night fell, when Elizabeth conjectured that he might have returned to the house. He was not there. We returned again with torches, for I could not rest, when I thought that my sweet boy had lost himself and was exposed to all the damps and dews of the night. Elizabeth also suffered extreme anguish. About 5 in the morning I discovered my lovely boy, whom the night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched on the grass, livid and motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his neck. He was conveyed home, and the anguish that was visible in my countenance betrayed the secret to Elizabeth. She was very earnest to see the corpse. Ernest is the other brother. Sorry. At first I attempted to prevent her, but she persisted, and entering the room where it lay, hastily examined the neck of the victim, and, clasping her hands, exclaimed, "Oh God, I have murdered my darling infant!" She fainted and was restored with extreme difficulty. When she again lived, it was only to weep and sigh. She told me that the same evening William had teased her to let him wear a very valuable miniature that she possessed of your mother. This picture is gone, and was doubtless the temptation which urged the murderer to the deed. We have no trace of him at present, although our exertions to discover him are unremitted. But they will not restore my beloved William. Come, dearest Victor, you alone can console Elizabeth. She weeps continually and accuses herself unjustly of the cause of his death. Her words pierce my heart. We are all unhappy, but will not be an additional motive for you, my son, to return and be our comforter? Your dear mother, alas, Victor, I now say, thank God she did not live to witness the cruel, miserable death of her youngest darling. I have spoilers, so I won't make a comment I want to. Come, Victor, not brooding thoughts of vengeance against the assassin, but with feelings of peace and gentleness that will heal instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who love you, and not with hatred for your enemies. Your affectionate and afflicted father, Alphonse Frankenstein. Geneva, May 12th, 1700. Clerval, who had watched my countenance as I read this letter, was surprised to observe the despair that succeeded to the joy I had at first expressed on receiving news from my friends. I threw the letter on the table and covered my face with my hands. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed Henry, when he perceived me weep with bitterness, "are you always to be unhappy? My dear friend, what has happened?" I motioned to him to take up the letter, while I walked up and down the room in extreme agitation. Tears also gushed from the eyes of Clerval as he read the account of my misfortune. "I can offer you no consolation, my friend," said he. "Your disaster is irreparable. What do you intend to do?" "To go instantly to Geneva. Come with me, Henry, to order the horses." During our walk, Clerval endeavored to raise my spirits. He did not do this by common topics of consolation, but by exhibiting the truest sympathy. "Poor William," said he. "That dear child, he now sleeps with his angel mother. His friends mourn and weep, but he is at rest. He does not now feel the murderer's grasp. A sod covers his gentle form, and he knows no pain. He can no longer be a fit subject for pity. The survivors are the greatest sufferers, and for them time is the only consolation. Those maxims of the Stoics, that death was no evil, and that the mind of man ought to be superior to despair on the eternal absence of a beloved object, ought not to be urged. Even Cato wept over the dead body of his brother. Clerval spoke thus as we hurried through the streets. The words impressed themselves on my mind, and I remembered them afterwards in solitude. But now, as the horses arrived, I hurried into a cabriole, and bade farewell to my friend. My journey was very melancholy. At first, I wished to hurry on, for I longed to console and sympathize with my loved and sorrowing friends. But when I drew near my native town, I slackened my progress. I could hardly sustain the multitude of feelings that crowded into my mind. I passed through scenes familiar to my youth, but which I had not seen for nearly 6 years. Now altered, everything might be during that time. One sudden and desolate change had taken place, but 1,000 little circumstances might have, by degrees, worked other alterations which, although they were done more tranquilly, might not be the less decisive. Fear overcame me. I dared not advance, dreading 1,000 nameless evils that made me tremble, although I was unable to define them. I remained 2 days at Lausanne in this painful state of mind. I contemplated the lake. The waters were placid, all around was calm, and the snowy mountains, the palaces of nature, were not changed. By degrees, the calm and heavenly scene restored me, and I continued my journey towards Geneva. The road ran by the side of the lake, which became narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear, the sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace, or to mock at my unhappiness? I fear, my friend, that I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances, but they were days of comparative happiness, and I think of them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country, who but a native can tell the delight I took in again beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and more than all thy lovely lake? Yet, as I drew nearer home, grief and fear again overcame me. Night also closed around, and when I could hardly see the dark mountains, I felt still more gloomily. The picture appeared a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. Alas, I prophesied truly and failed only in one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Secron, a village half a league to the east of the city. The sky was serene, and as I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive at Plain Palace. During this short voyage, I saw the lightnings play on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and on landing, I ascended a low hill, that I might observe its progress. It advanced, the heavens were clouded, and soon I felt the rain coming slowly in large drops. But its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst with a terrific crash over my head. It was echoed from Salève to the Joris and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzled my eyes, illuminating the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Then, for an instant, everything seemed of pitchy darkness, until the eye recovered itself from the presiding flash. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. The most violent storm hung exactly north of the town, over that part of the lake which lies between the promontory of Belvier and the village of Copet. Another storm enlightened Jura with faint flashes, and another darkened and sometimes disclosed the Mole, a peaked mountain to the east of the lake. While I watched the storm, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I mean, fair. I love thunderstorms, even being out in them. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object, and discovered its shape plainly to me, its gigantic stature, and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. What did he there? What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed that fair child. He was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me hanging among the rocks of the nearly perpendicular ascent of Mount Salve, a hill that bounds Plainpalais on the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I revolved in my mind the events which I had until now sought to forget, the whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of the work of my own hands alive at my bedside, its departure. 2 years had nearly elapsed since the night on which he first received life. And was this his first crime? Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch whose delight was in carnage and misery. Had he not murdered my brother? No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night, which I spent, cold and wet, in the open air. But I did not feel the inconvenience of the weather. My imagination was busy in scenes of evil and despair. I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind and endowed with the will and power to effect purposes of horror, such as the deed which he had now done. Nearly in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. Day dawned, and I directed my steps towards the town. The gates were open, and I hastened to my father's house. My first thought was to discover what I knew of the murderer, and cause instant pursuit to be made. But I paused when I had reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being whom I myself had formed and endued with life had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever with which I had been seized just at the time when I dated my creation, and which would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly improbable. I well knew that if any other had communicated such a relation to me, I should have looked upon it as the ravings of insanity. Besides, the strange nature of the animal would elude all pursuit, even if I were so far credited as to persuade my relatives to commence it. Besides, of what use would be the pursuit? Who could arrest a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mount Salve?
These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent. It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family, and went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. 6 years had elapsed, passed as a dream but for one indelible trace, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure for Ingolstadt. Beloved and respectable parent, he still remained to me. I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was a historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Beaufort in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. Okay, so I'm a macabre person, but that's a kind of creepy thing to have commissioned to paint and put in your study or library. Yes, let me see my dead wife mourning her father by his casket. Yep. Her garb was rustic and her cheek pale, but there was an air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted the sentiment of pity. Below this picture was a miniature of William, and my tears flowed when I looked upon it. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. He had heard me arrive and hastened to welcome me. He expressed a sorrowful delight to see me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," said he. "I wish you had come 3 months ago, and then you would have found us all joyous and delighted. But we are now unhappy, and, I am afraid, tears instead of smiles will be your welcome. Our father looks so sorrowful. This dreadful event seems to have revived in his mind his grief on the death of Mamma." Hey, he actually says Mamma instead of my mother. "Poor Elizabeth also is quite inconsolable." Ernest began to weep as he said these words. "Do not," said I, "welcome me thus. Try to be more calm, that I may not be absolutely miserable the moment I enter my father's house after so long an absence." "I'm sorry. Y'all just lost a sibling. I know that he must have been just born when you left, but y'all just lost a brother. Don't be like, oh, you can't assault me with misery when I first enter the house. No, y'all are all miserable. Be nice. But tell me, how does my father support his misfortunes? And how is my poor Elizabeth?" No, hey, how are you too? Ernest is a human too. "She indeed requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that made her very wretched. But since the murderer has been discovered—" "The murderer discovered? Good God, how can that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well try to overtake the winds or confine a mountain stream with a straw." "I don't know what you mean, but we were all very unhappy when she was discovered. No one would believe it at first, and even now Elizabeth will not be convinced, notwithstanding all the evidence. Indeed, who would credit that Justine Moritz, who was so amiable and fond of all the family, could all at once become so extremely wicked?" "Yes, she's accused of killing willfully her entire family and going back to the Frankensteins. Why not kill the youngest child?" "Justine Moritz? Poor girl. Is she the accused? But it is wrongfully. Everyone knows that. No one believes it, surely, Ernest." "No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us, and her own behavior has been so confused as to add to the evidence of the facts a weight that, I fear, leaves no hope for doubt. But she will be tried today, and you will then hear all." He related that, the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had been taken ill and confined to her bed, and after several days, one of the servants happened to examine the apparel she had worn on the night of the murder, had discovered in her pocket the picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. The servant instantly showed it to one of the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to a magistrate, and upon their deposition Justine was apprehended. On being charged with the fact, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion in great measure by her extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but it did not shake my faith, and I replied earnestly, "You are all mistaken. I know the murderer. Justine, poor good Justine, is innocent." At that instant my father entered. I saw unhappiness deeply impressed on his countenance, but he endeavored to welcome me cheerfully, and after we had exchanged our mournful greeting, would have introduced some other topic than that of our disaster, had not Ernest exclaimed, "Good God, Papa! Victor says he knows who was the murderer of poor William." "We do also, unfortunately," replied my father, "for indeed I had rather have been forever ignorant than have discovered so much depravity and ingratitude in one I valued so highly." "My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent." "If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I sincerely hope, that she will be acquitted." This speech calmed me. I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human being, was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her, and in this assurance I calmed myself, expecting the trial with eagerness, but without prognosticating an evil result. We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had made great alterations in her form since I had last beheld her. 6 years before she had been a pretty, good-humored girl whom every one loved and caressed. Caress? That seems like the wrong choice of word. She was now a woman in stature and expression of countenance which was uncommonly lovely. An open and capacious forehead gave indications of a good understanding, joined to a great frankness of disposition. Her eyes were hazel and expressive of mildness, now though recent affliction allied to sadness. Her hair was of a rich, dark auburn, her complexion fair, and her figure slight and graceful. She welcomed me with the greatest affection. "Your arrival, my dear cousin," she says, "fills me with hope. You perhaps will find some means to justify my poor guiltless Justine. Alas, who is safe if she be convicted of a crime? I rely on her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have not only lost that lovely, darling boy, but this poor girl, whom I sincerely love, is to be torn away by even a worse fate. If she is condemned, I never shall know joy more. But she will not. I am sure she will not. And then I shall be happy again, even after the sad death of my beloved little William." "She is innocent, my Elizabeth," said I, "and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal." "How kind you are! Everyone else believes in her guilt, and that made me wretched, for I knew that it was impossible. And to see everyone else prejudiced in so deadly a manner rendered me hopeless and despairing," she wept. "Sweet niece," said my father, "dry your tears. If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our judges and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality." I hope their justices are better than ours. All right. And with that, I will conclude today's reading. We are 30% of the way, so another 70% if you will bear with me in my readings. There are 23 chapters, and we will begin again on chapter 7. Hope you listen next time. And again, if you are so inclined, there is a Facebook page that is called the Tangents on Cracked Spines Book Club, so that y'all can interact with each other and talk about what I'm reading, give me suggestions, and maybe even suggestions for the next story to read as I drop things. And I will respond as best I can. And again, you can follow me on most platforms, and anyone that allows a review would be appreciated if you left one. Good, bad, or otherwise, they all show me whether I'm doing well or if I can improve. Thank you and have a great day.